Most listened to Saturday morning streaming media political talk shows going today. And it's all right here on our flagship station, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. So join me, the Fed, for Inside the Eye Live every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern. It is truly intelligent media for the politically aware.
Welcome to Sacred Matrix, a divine paradigm of love and universal consciousness, with your host, Janet Kira Lessin and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Together, we transform the world.
And now, here are your hosts, Janet Kira and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Aloha, and welcome to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com with your host, Janet Kira Lessin and Dr. Sasha Lessin. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Bruce Maccabee. And here's a little bit about his bio. U.S. Navy Research Physicist Bruce Maccabee is the author of the UFO FBI Connection, The Secret History of the Government's Cover-Up. We're going to talk about that later on the show. Bruce received his Ph.D. in physics from American University in Washington, D.C. in 1970. He was hired by the U.S. Department of the Navy to be a physics researcher at what was then called the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, NOL, and that name was later changed to the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Dahlgren Division, where Dr. Maccabee has worked ever since. Dr. Maccabee says, with FOIA releases and document leaks, we're learning more about what happened years ago than they knew years ago. So we're going to bring on Dr. Maccabee in just a moment here. Dr. Lessin, would you like to say anything before we bring on Bruce?
Well, one of the interesting things about Bruce's work is how he's showed how, by analysis of the pictures and the context in which the pictures are taken, you can see whether pictures of UFOs, which ones are fakes, which ones are accidents, and which ones are likely to be genuine. And for me, one of the most interesting questions is, why do people fake? What are the different categories of fakers? What we find in psychology is the way people lie will point directly to what's really going on. So that's what the underlying question I would have is, is the cover-up being of the alien presence and of our own aircraft that are modeled on the alien craft, is this continuing to be concealed? Because if you start to reveal the truth about these things, there's a lot of murders and wars and false flag events that will also be uncovered, unleashing all kinds of lawsuits and even criminal suits, unless there's some kind of forgiveness program.
And with that, welcome Dr. Maccabee to our show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
We're very happy to have you with us today. What would you like to tell our listeners about who you are and your research that I missed in your brief bio that I said at the beginning of the show?
Well, of course, I've been working on this since the latter half of the 1960s, when I first got seriously interested in it. And I started doing
What made you get interested in UFOs and the whole field?
Yeah, right, UFOs. Primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And I started doing innovative research, you might say, in the early 70s. And I guess I tackled one of the toughest cases of all, which is still being argued up and down, the Trent photo case that was publicized in the Conan study, the Conan report, the University of Colorado study done in the 1968 and 69. I was the only case of the photo analyst from the Condon study claimed that he thought it was real. And the one thing about the Trent case is the thing in a photograph is either the real thing or a hoax. There's no halfway point. It's not a misidentified airplane or a bird or something.
So how do you make that determination? What do you do in your investigations to determine if something's real or fake, or now we have to look at it as it's extraterrestrial or of human origin? How do you make those determinations?
Well, the extraterrestrial versus human has to come from the shape and the dynamics and so on. But whether it's real or fake, there's two things you have to look at. One is the photo itself, and the other is the context, the circumstantial evidence that goes along with the photograph. I was once told by a lawyer that in a court case which involves physical evidence, the case is not very often made based on the physical evidence, because whatever you assert about the physical evidence, one authority will say one thing, and the opposite side can hire somebody who will say something else. He said that instead, the case is made on the circumstantial evidence. In the Trent photo case, which, as I said, is, and that, by the way, starts off the new book, the FBI UFO, CIA UFO Connection. I started talking about the Trent case because that's how I got the UFO files. In the Trent case, you can look at the lifestyle of the Trents. The whole life of the Trents ended in 1995. I mean, the photos were taken in 1950. You can track their whole life and lifestyle from the time the photos were taken onwards and see if there's any evidence that they might have been likely to hoax anything at all, say nothing of a UFO photo. So I had to divide my investigation into two parts. One is looking at the photos themselves, and the other is looking at the whole life history of the Trents. The photos themselves, I looked for any evidence of a hoax that was in the photos. And the photos show overhead wires running from the house to the barn in this picture. And the UFO itself, the image of the UFO is lower down. So the immediate thought is, well, somebody could hang a model and photograph the model. There have been a number of laboratories that have looked at these two negatives and tried to find the image of the string or any evidence at all that this thing was fake. They can't find any proof of fakery in the photos themselves. I learned during this investigation that a UFO does not make. You can always argue that the witness was clever enough to create a photo that was, or you couldn't determine that it was a fake. In other words, you can always assume something about the cleverness or capabilities of the witness.
Mm-hmm.
But the minute you start attributing something to the witness, you then have to bring in the circumstantial evidence to answer for. And for example, in this case, would Mr. Trent, who took the photos, have been clever enough to pick a string that color matched the background sky, so that when he took the photograph, he did photograph the string, but it was so close to the color of the sky that you couldn't see it. In other words, you've got to have contrast between two things, either color or brightness or both. Contrast in order to see something. If you're in a room that's perfectly white all the way around, you can't tell anything about the room, which way you're looking or anything like that. But if you've got other colors and so on in there, then you can that amounts to information. Information comes from changes in contrast. Well, in the Trent case, the photos, as I said, have been searched by a number of organizations to try to find evidence of a fakery, and they haven't. So then the next question is, would the Trents have been likely to think of creating a UFO hoax in 1950? This is 3 years after the UFO phenomenon sort of began in June of 1947. So 3 years later in McMinnville, Oregon, or outside of McMinnville, close to it, Mr. and Mrs. Trent saw an object flying by. It paused in its motion, and Mr. Trent took a couple of photographs, and then it just zipped away. And that's a very basic story in it. And I spent a lot of time studying the Trents, and I actually talked to Mrs. Trent probably for almost 24 hours over a period of several years in numerous phone calls. It's hard to imagine anybody more transparent than she was as far as character is concerned.
Well, I'm looking here on I Googled Trent UFOs, and there seems to be a number of pictures, but they might be different sections of the same photo. How many photos were there that they took?
There are only 2 photos.
Two photos.
If you look up and got the Life file, the Life magazine file, the Life magazine people sent a photographer to the Trent farm, and that guy took a whole bunch of pictures. There are only 2 Trent photos, and when I did my first study on the Trent photos to try to confirm or deny what William Hartman of the Condon Report had written about them, I used the actual negatives themselves. Very few people have had access to the negatives.
And so what did the report say about it, to the committee, the congressional committee?
It wasn't congressional, although I will say Congress directed the Air Force to set up an independent investigation. In 1965 and 66, there was a big flap of sightings. You know, by the mid-60s, the Air Force had been saying for years by that time, I've not been saying for years, there's nothing to it, folks. But we're keeping our nose to the grindstone and paying attention to sightings, but there's really nothing to it. And then in 1965 and 1966, there was a big flap of sightings in the Midwest, including some in Illinois, and Gerald Ford, who was the minority leader of the House at the time. Some sightings occurred right in his own backyard in Hillsdale, Michigan. And,
did he see them?
He didn't see them, but a number of well-qualified people saw these things essentially landed and taking off. And so he managed to convince Congress to direct the Air Force to have a independent investigation that is independent of the Project Blue Book that had been going on. I assume anybody who spends any time studying about UFOs has heard of Project Blue Book, which was the Air Force project from the official name from 1952 on to 1969. The Air Force started investigating in 1947. In 1948, they started a specific project called SIGN that lasted a year, and then they started a project. They continued the investigation under the name Grudge, which lasted a couple of years, and then they changed it to Blue Book, which lasted until 1969. That was in the 65-66 time frame. They had this sighting flap that caused Congress to direct the Air Force to hold an independent investigation because people were not accepting the Air Force explanation. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was the astronomy and science consultant to Project Blue Book, was called into the Hillsdale sightings in Michigan in spring of 1966 and essentially directed to come up with an explanation. And he came up with this swamp gas that people hear about all along. That was where the swamp gas explanation came into ufology. And ever since then, people have often said, oh, yeah, well, it's just nothing but swamp gas. Even Hynek admitted years later that made no sense because it was in March and swamp gas comes out in the summer.
Right.
Anyway, because of his explanation...
Did Hynek say he was deliberately misinformationing people, or did he really believe it was swamp gas?
Well, it was a combination of Hynek and the press. The press tends to go for the throat, whatever's the most amusing part of the story. Hynek said some of the sightings near the ground might have been swamp gas. Now, there were things where they were hovering above the trees and lights moving around and all sorts of stuff. And even he knew that swamp gas didn't explain all of it. So he said some of it might be swamp gas. And the press jumped on that immediately and essentially made it all swamp gas. So anyway, Hynek in later years disavowed that explanation. But the point is, it was such a ridiculous explanation that the general population, including Gerald Ford, thought there's something going on here that we ought to know about. The Air Force must be covering up. And by that time, there had been some 20 years of UFO sightings almost. And there hadn't been any, people have been aware of it for 20 years, but there hadn't been any definitive proof. The Air Force always said there was nothing to it. We haven't found anything, and certainly no interplanetary visitors. but there were a lot of sightings that couldn't be explained.
Well, this Trent UFO, I'm looking at the Google images. They have several other sightings, and what's unique about that UFO is it has kind of like a nipple at the very top, like a hat.
Right.
So they're showing one from France in March of '54, the same shape as the Trent UFO. So that also, I look at the overall picture like, okay, is this same UFO being seen other times, other places? And so that might add to it being legit.
Right. That picture was actually taken in March of 1957 and published in a magazine called the Royal Air Force Flying Review in May or June of '57, and also in a British, what's it called, British UFO journal. It was published in 2 different journals in 1957, but nobody has ever determined who took the picture. The picture of that's R-O-U-E-N, Rouen, France. The Rouen photo. The Rouen photo is not simply a copy of one of the edge view photo of the Trents. It's got a different tilt to it. So I've often wondered, could this be confirmation? It probably is, but like I said, since we don't have any witness to talk to, we don't know where the photo came from exactly.
Right.
In my own work, I've mentioned the thing, but I haven't used it as confirming evidence. On my website, there's a couple of big, long papers on the Trent case. In the book, the FBI-CIA UFO Connection, I give links. If somebody gets an e-book, they can immediately go to these things that are linked. And the Trent case, oddly enough, is the reason my book exists. Part of the reason, as I explain in the beginning of the book, the FBI-CIA UFO Connection, as I begin explaining in the book. It was while I was investigating Mr. Trent that I came upon his claim that FBI agents had come to where he worked and inquired him a couple of weeks after his photos were published. His photos were published in June 8th of 1950, about a month after they were taken. And so in 1976, when I was doing this Trent investigation, I did that. I investigated the Trent case from 1974 up until 1980 something. And I even had changes in my report up to the year 2000. But anyway, in 1976, I decided to see under the Freedom of Information Act, see if I could get any information out of the FBI on Trent, just to know, not what they might have found out about him, but just to know that they had contacted him would confirm his story. So I wrote in September of '76 a letter to the FBI saying, please tell me if you have a file on Polly Trent of McMinnville, Oregon, and so on. And then almost as a second thought, oh, by the way, if you got anything else on UFOs, please let me know. I didn't expect to get anything directly on UFOs because the only reference I was aware of that mentioned FBI activities was the book by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. That book is sort of the primer, the basic book that anyone should read if they want to get into this subject. Ruppelt had said that the FBI was never officially interested in the flying saucer business. So I didn't expect to get anything. And about 6 months later, while I'm sitting there at my desk at work, I get a phone call from a very surprised FBI agent who says, not only did they investigate UFOs, there's over 1,000 pages of stuff here in the FBI file on flying discs.
Wow.
And I was surprised, of course. Back in those days, they charged 10 cents a shot for pages. He said, I'll be happy to search through the most important ones and send them to you. So he sent me 470 pages worth of documents.
Wow.
And subsequently, I got the rest, a total of 1,600 pages. They're all on microfilm on the FBI, they're microfilm copies, but they're in PDF form at the FBI website. You can get all documents. Unfortunately, for anybody getting them on the website, they're all jumbled up. It would be nice if they had put them in historical order, but anyway.
So someone has to do that if they want to make any sense out of it, put it in order.
Yeah, right. The point is that it was because and the guy said, confidentially speaking, we're not supposed to say anything about investigations of individual people. But he said, we don't have any file on Trent. He also told me that I asked, what are the chances that the files would still be existing, if there were files? And he said that the branches, local district offices of the FBI had a 5 or 10 year rule that after 5 or 10 years they could destroy documents if there hadn't been anything, any activity in a file for 5 or more years, they could destroy it. But Congress had directed the headquarters FBI never to destroy anything. And so here in 1977, when I got these documents, I was the first person outside the FBI to read documents that had been written some 20 years before, 30 years before, I should say. And the reason I had them was because the FBI just couldn't throw them away.
Right.
And that's where this whole FBI book started. My first intent was to write a book outlining what was in the FBI file so that other people could see for themselves that the FBI had actually investigated. But in the present book, the FBI-CIA UFO Connection, I combine Air Force files, FBI files, and CIA files to argue, I think for the first time successfully, using unquestionably authentic documents, that the Air Force was covering up the fact that they knew there were interplanetary visitors.
Was there a record that the FBI had contacted Trent?
No, he said no.
No, they didn't. They denied it, but he wasn't lying. They must have been lying. Someone was lying, right? Trent said he was talked to by the FBI. The FBI said we didn't talk to him.
Oh, no, yeah. the FBI guy said he didn't know. He said, we have no record on Trent, which means there would be no record at headquarters FBI. There might have been a record in the office at McMinnville or the office at Portland or whatever, but it would have been long gone by the time I called up for it.
Got it.
So, go ahead.
It was only because the headquarters of the FBI had been directed to say everything, no matter what, that there were any documents available for me to look at all. Now, what made the FBI file really important was the fact that it acted like a black hole. Information went in and didn't come out. Nobody expected information to come out until the FBI, the FOIA, Freedom of Information and Privacy Act, which started being effective in 1975. The Air Force told stuff to the FBI that it didn't tell the American people. And because the FBI couldn't destroy records, we have records of what the Air Force told the FBI way back in 1952.
What did they tell them?
They told them that 2 to 3% of the sightings couldn't be explained, and top-level brass in the Air Force were seriously considering interplanetary ships.
Wow, that's cool.
Now,
so what's the CIA?
In my book, it's like adding pebble after pebble after pebble to the weight of something or other. And eventually it gets to the point where you have to say, well, yep, they're here.
Mm-hmm.
Were
the Trents punished or pressured at all about this stuff?
Not pressured or punished. They were, you might say, they were harassed. Mm-hmm. Harassed by people who didn't believe they were telling the truth. People who thought there's nothing to UFOs. There's no evidence that the Air Force harassed them. There's no evidence that any governmental agency harassed them, but they got plenty. Mrs. Trent told me she was called all sorts of names and by people sending letters. She said if she saw a barn fly by, she'd never take another picture.
Wow. So what do you think are the cases, the best cases in all these years of investigating and things that you've heard and you've personally investigated? What are the best cases that prove the extraterrestrial presence here on Earth?
Well, of course, I can speak most knowledgeably about the ones that I've investigated myself. There are others that. So I'm not claiming that what I talk about is the only good evidence.
Do you have any opinions on some of the other things like Roswell and Kingman and
Dulce
and all that stuff?
Yeah, no, I have not investigated those. I've stuck to photos, videos, film, and historical research.
Well, I just wondered if you had any opinions on them, just like an over.
I think my personal opinion is Roswell is real, Dulce is not. I forget the other things that you mentioned.
Kingman,
I don't know about.
Area 51.
Area 51 is definitely a place. Whether they've got, well, like I say at the end of the book, if somebody were to tell, if the government were to suddenly admit that they had aliens at Area 51, I wouldn't be a bit surprised.
That's cool.
So anyway, you asked about what are the best cases.
Yeah.
Yes, one of the best cases. Yeah.
Certainly the Trent case. You gotta hand it to the Trents. Their photos have taken up probably now more argumentation by the skeptics than any other photo case ever. The Trent case has been around since 1950, and it was argued by William Hartman during the Condon study. And then when I started doing investigation, the skeptics started coming out of the woodwork, and they still are. But for my money, anybody can read what I wrote on my website, www.brumac.8k.com. Anybody can read what I wrote, which basically is the idea of the Trents hoaxing anything, to say nothing of a UFO sighting, is, in my opinion, ridiculous based on their personal character and their personal history. Other things, I can't think of them all right off the top of my head. A photo taken by a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot in 1955. R.J. Childerhouse was flying in a jet at 40,000 feet, and he looked down and saw this big, bright, shiny object hovering near a big cloud, and he took a photograph of it. That photo was even endorsed as being real by the world's greatest skeptic, Philip J. Klass.
Oh, really?
He put it on the front cover. He put it on the front cover of his first book, UFOs Identified. But he thought it was a big plasma. He didn't think it was an extraterrestrial vehicle. Anyway.
Plasma, okay.
Yeah, right. There's the Rex Heflin case in the Socorro case, Socorro, New Mexico, along Zamora, one person sighting, but backed up almost immediately by people who interviewed Zamora within minutes of this object disappearing. People who read into UFOs will recognize that. It's discussed in my book because it's the last big case in the FBI file because an FBI agent was one of the people who interviewed Zamora. And for photo cases, there's a Rex Heflin photo in 1965, I believe it was. And I like Gemini 11 spacecraft photograph, a couple of photographs of some object going by the Gemini 11 spacecraft in September of 1966. And in September of 1973, Skylab photo. This is taken, the three astronauts in the Skylab saw a reddish thing sort of hovering near their spacecraft. Took 4 pictures of it. The 4th picture shows a really odd structured image shape, which could have been hundreds of feet in size. It was something red. There aren't any red satellites up there. Satellites are black, white, or shiny metal.
What did Kenneth Arnold see? If we go back in time, he was one of the, we have the sightings in World War II and the Foo Fighters. And what do you think was going on with the Foo Fighters? What was that?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, that's sort of, those are lights moving through the sky around the aircraft that were flying, not just in Europe, but in the Asian war as well. And that makes me think of in the 1948, 49, 50 time frame, the green fireballs that were sighted over what I call vital installations. The FBI, these things turn up in the FBI file as well as the Air Force file because the FBI was responsible for protection of vital installations against communist sabotage. And the green fireballs were not real. Certainly did not have the characteristics of ordinary fireballs, which are seen at odd times all around the world. These green fireballs were concentrated at areas where there was nuclear research going on. Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they designed atomic bombs, had some of the first sightings. Then Sandia Laboratory, near Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico, had sightings. That's where they made atomic bombs. And then Chilean Base at Fort Hood was where they were storing atomic bombs. All these places in the southwest White Sands area and so on, where they launch rockets, we're getting all sorts of sightings, and including these green fireball things that were sort of analogous to the Foo Fighters in World War II. The Foo Fighters that I guess didn't have any particular color to them. The green fireballs were green. A famous meteoricist, somebody who studies meteors, by the name of Lincoln LaPaz, said whatever they weren't meteors. He believed that if they weren't our secret projects, that they must have been Russian, and he furthermore argued that if they were Russian, they were launched from Russia, and they came over the pole and were burning out at distances of our vital installations, and were probably radio controlled by people on the ground near the end of the track, just where it faded out. And he was arguing that after they had zeroed in on our installations, they'd load these things with atomic bombs and send them over. This wasn't a very comforting thought. And
No.
poor J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI guys got this in spades. That
So these were like
fireballs
fireballs. They weren't like the big globes. I've seen some large kind of globes that were floating, and I didn't know what to make of them. That was back in the 60s, and we'd see them all the time. We, just didn't.
There were sightings of floating globes, or whatever you want to call it, balls of light at the Fort Hood area. Quite independent of the green fireballs. The green fireballs are traveling at very high speeds, thousands of miles an hour, according to the meteorologist Lincoln LaPaz. But the FBI was told, heard the Air Force. The Air Force had to admit that there were green fireball sightings because lots of civilians saw them, as well as the security police around the vital installation areas. The Air Force couldn't just cover up the green fireball sightings. But what they said was they were all meteors, in spite of what Lincoln LaPaz was saying on a secret level. He was saying that they were probably Russian missiles. And J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI boys were hearing, on the one hand, the public statements by the Air Force that there's nothing there, poo-poo, don't worry about it. And on the other hand, on the secret level, they were hearing that these were Russian missiles. So you have to ask what was a poor FBI agent to think.
Right.
On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, everything was okay. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, all hell was breaking loose.
So did the Russians ever comment, now that we went through Glasnost and stuff like that, did they or didn't they?
Well, they had their own sightings. But in the 50s and 60s and 70s, before Glasnost and Perestroika and all that good stuff, to report a flying saucer was a no-no. There was a period of time in 1967 and 68, just after the Condon report was studied. And I remember I said the Condon study was directed by Congress to hold an independent investigation of the UFO phenomenon, independent of Project Blue Book. And for that period of time, it was about a year, it was okay, it was sort of legitimate to talk about flying saucers without having a bag over your head. I mean that in the United States. And that's when I got involved, got interested in it while I was going to American University. A couple of guys from a UFO group called NICAP visited the university and gave a lecture. And that's when I got interested in it, thinking that I had read a book about the subject called Flying Saucer Serious Business by Frank Edwards. And then I went and heard this lecture, and I decided, well, maybe I'll join up to this NICAP and see what's going on. Mm-hmm. But about that same time, there was a thaw in the UFO Iron Curtain in Russia, and it became okay to talk about UFOs in Russia without having a bag over your head. But then when the condom study essentially covered up, if you want to put it like that, they essentially rejected the whole UFO phenomenon. The lid went back down on top of it in the Soviet Union as well. And from then on, there was hardly any mention, or maybe no mention at all, of UFOs in the Soviet literature until about 1985, when this glasnost started to have an effect.
Well, it seems like the various governments have an agreement to keep the whole issue secret, from the general public. Globally.
That may be on a very deep level where there was coordination going on. I don't really know. But it's clear that the Soviets did have their own sightings. After it became possible to talk about that stuff, about in the mid-'70s, a guy by the name of Zsa said that he had been appointed by a Russian agency to investigate some flying saucer sightings by the Russian Navy. And he told me one time of a sighting that occurred, I guess it would have been in the 1970s, so I'm not sure exactly. He didn't specify when. A Soviet submarine that was in the Pacific Ocean doing maneuvers all of a sudden became aware of some large body, which they assumed was an American sub, not too far from them. They all were sending out acoustic pings, little beeps of sound, and listening for echoes. And so they were suddenly getting an echo that they hadn't had before. And the Soviet guy tried to do maneuvers to shake the American, what he assumed was an American sub, and he couldn't do it. So finally gets all peed off and decides to go up and confront the guy directly. And they surface, and he goes up on the tower, and as he's standing there watching, all of a sudden something comes up out of the water, hovers a little bit, and then takes off at high speed. Obviously not an American sub. This is Zsa, Zsa told me he was the pilot of the first Soviet sub to go onto the North Pole. That would have been in the late 50s, after our own submarine called the Nautilus did it first. And then he said that he was the captain of the first submarine to do it. This he's telling me in 1990. Mm-hmm. Well after Perestroika and all that sort of stuff. It said in the 1980s, mid-80s. So anyway, he told me some other stories too. But there are books on the subject, and there's going to be another one coming out pretty soon by the Richard Dolan Press, covering Soviet sightings.
Do you have any evidence, or how does it look in terms of whether the naval intelligence or some kind of someone on our side is really running some of these crafts? We've heard rumors like that.
Are we running craft?
Yeah.
Is that what you asked?
That's
some of these secret projects of our own military.
Yeah. Well, it's been my own opinion that flying saucers or interplanetary craft or alien flying craft, AFC is what I call them. It's been my own personal opinion that AFC are so far ahead of us that we've got a long way still to catch up. There are certainly lots of claims made about transfer of technology from alien craft that is reverse engineering that comes up with something or other. And
have you investigated or have any ideas of what kind of extraterrestrial beings are operating these craft?
Well, the only way I can go about that is, of course, to talk about abduction stuff. There have been a number of different types of entities reported over the years. The abductees probably got the most consistent description of grays, but there are certainly lots of variations, and not all the evidence that not all the sighting evidence that we use to try to decide what these aliens are of equal credibility. And of course, we don't know about what they're using mind control on abductees and contactees, and putting into people's minds. Put it like this: if an alien were to stand in front of you and tell you a big long story about what he is, where he comes from, and all that, would you believe him? Would you have any way of checking?
There's no way of. Well, that's what they were talking about, the alien interview with the Roswell Gray. There's a whole book on it by Lawrence Spencer. And, so they have a whole book and everything she's saying, but how do you know it's true, what she's saying? And,
well, that's right.
how do you know?
There are certainly enough variations. And the closest one that I'm familiar with is the story, the abduction experiences of Ed Walters in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Since I was working closely on that case, I became aware of his claims of abduction as coming out under hypnosis by a clinical psychologist.
So what was he saying?
If there's one thing that seemed to be common in his sightings, it was that he was being used as some sort of a human example to train small ones, their children, whatever, in human responses to various situations, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Ed wrote a book about that called Abductions in Gulf Breeze.
Okay, Abductions in Gulf.
The interesting thing about that was he for many years he had done sleep. Well, when he would wake up in the middle of the night having a dream, he would write down what the dream was about in the middle of the night and then go back to sleep. Wake up the next morning and find that he'd written some sort of a story of what happened tonight. And he became aware that he was writing these stories about being on board craft and having things happen to him. This was all before he had notes on his sleep stories, whatever you want to call them, before he was hypnotized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's
conscious recall.
He filled in a lot of details. The hypnosis filled in a lot of details with respect to his stories.
Yeah, that's what we do in our practice. When we have someone who has something they remember consciously under hypnosis, they can recall, more details. But and I'm an experiencer, abductee, contactee, whatever you call it. And so I've worked with, my husband, Dr. Lesson, who is a hypnotherapist. And so we've gone deep into a lot of things that, and I'm sitting there and these things are coming out, and it's way beyond anything I can make up. It's like I couldn't imagine that in a million years. And so...
Well, we have no reference for the ontological status of the productions. All we can see is internal consistency, but there's no way to determine the reality status in most cases.
Well, I know, but in the case of Ed Walters, there was one event that left some physical evidence, and that was March 1980. This is March 1988, or not March, May 1, 1988. By this time, he had a number of sightings, and Gulf Breeze had become the UFO capital of the world for a period of time there. And it was mostly notable because of the pictures that he took, but what the skeptics and everybody else seems to ignore is there are probably a couple hundred other witnesses. Only a few people knew that Ed was involved and knew him personally. There certainly was no grand collusion on the part of the residents of Gulf Breeze in Pensacola, Florida, to hold this huge set of sightings. But Ed called me up. Well, first of all, let me say, he's the first and only person to use stereo cameras to photograph UFOs. and he got two Model 600 Polaroids. When you press the button, it takes a picture and ejects the film immediately. So it's kind of hard to fake. He had his camera set up on the shoreline of Shoreline Park on the south side of the Gulf Breeze Peninsula. It's facing south over the Santa Rosa Sound, for those of you who are listening here from Florida. And he saw an object appear out there, and he took the two pictures, the left and right photographs. The left and right photographs actually captured two different objects of different sizes, different distances, and the length of the so-called Bob Sykes Bridge up to 7,000 feet away. So what this amounted to was he incorporated in these photos a calibration. So by taking a stereo pair, you can measure distance. The cameras were 2 feet apart, which is good enough to be able to measure distances out to a couple of hundred feet at least. So he told me the next day about this sighting he had, and how he suddenly he took the picture and then noticed that these objects had moved. There was something right over his head, and he sort of has a whiteout situation, a very blinding flash of light. Next thing he knows, he finds himself picking himself up off the beach, right at the edge of the water, and he looks at his watch, and it's about an hour and 20 minutes missing. And he gets a picture in his head of his daughter, and he suddenly thinks he's coming to take my daughter, and he gets it back in his truck, picks up the camera, gets back in his truck, and drives home and sits outside his daughter's bedroom. She was there, and everything was okay, but he sits outside her bedroom until late morning, and then he went into the bathroom, and he had a sort of a headache, and he noticed on his head, on his forehead, above his nose, a red spot. Then as he's feeling around his head, he feels a bump on the left temple, a bump on the right temple, and another bump on the back of his head. He actually had this one on the forehead photographed by one of the UFO investigators a day later. But he was telling me about it, and the interesting thing is these bumps were recorded, okay, but nobody knew what they meant. Under hypnosis, many weeks later, under hypnosis, he's telling the story of how he was taken on board into a room, and he's sitting on a table, and these taller creatures, the standard sort of gray type, but bigger ones, bring in a bunch of small ones and set them on a table or something. Because they bring a thing down out of the ceiling that's got 4 points to it. It's like a big plus sign, but bent down, but with the arms of the plus bent downward so that they can contact his head at 4 different points, above his nose, left temple, right temple, and the back. And he says they bring in these little creatures and put the same sort of a hat, or whatever you want to call it, on them. And he says then all of a sudden he would find himself rerunning an event that had happened in the past in his life.
Oh, okay.
Then they would take these little creatures out and bring in some more and crank him up again like a video recorder. So now he had written down many months earlier during one of his sleep writing things the statement, "The news must learn." And we were puzzling over, what does that mean, the news? Everybody thinks of the news, N-E-W-S, the newspaper. What? The newspaper can't learn anything. But then it occurred to me, after I'm thinking about it, the news really should have been the new ones. The new ones must learn. So
newbies.
That's where he had written. That's where he had written the stuff. The news must learn, months before he found out what that really meant from his hypnosis session. So that's a hypnosis case. The measurable remaining evidence that was on his head actually meant something in terms of the story that he told under hypnosis.
So it's good if you have any kind of markings and you suspect you're missing time to sooner rather than later track down a good hypnotherapist and uncover what was going on.
That's right. He didn't have any scoop marks or the stuff that we were accustomed to for abduction.
Well, how do you deal with the pollution now that we know all this stuff? With the abductees, how do we know they're not just kind of writing what happened before? They're like saying the same thing because they already know about that information. How do we avoid the pollution of the information that's coming out from these people?
Well, how can you apply a truth detector, essentially? And there's one thing I learned in investigating UFOs is you really can't trust anybody, not even yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have backup. You have to have as much independent corroboration as you can get before you really begin to believe something.
So what is the motive? I understand the government is trying to obfuscate, but why are so many thousands of people posting all these things on my Facebook all the time?
Well,
Are you on Facebook?
I don't know exactly what they're posting.
The pictures of UFOs doing this and that from all over the world, and people in every country speaking all these different languages. Hey, look at that, blah, blah, blah. And some of them, there's no way I can tell.
Well, there's certainly a lot of fabulous fakes out there. The first hint that something's wrong is anonymous. Somebody posts pictures and says they're anonymous. Anonymous posted this, anonymous posted that. If there isn't a witness behind it, forget it. It has to be really somehow self-proving. And I don't know how you would create a picture that's totally self-proving because, as I said, you can always argue that almost or maybe every photo could be faked. The ex post facto type of analysis is you're presented with a picture and you said, okay, now how'd the guy fake this? And if you say, well, you're going to restrict yourself to the capabilities of the person who knows no more than pushing a button on a camera, probably it couldn't be faked by that person. But if you find that the photo was taken by somebody who works for one of those Hollywood firms for generating movies and stuff,
right? Well, they have a lot of time to be fake.
If Spielberg came up with a real UFO photo, it would be too bad. Nobody would believe it.
Well, when you look at all the fake photos, I mean, looking at it logically, these people have a lot of time to waste. They're on the internet and they're taking all this time doing these CGI these fake photos.
Why would they do this?
So, or else, maybe they're real. How to determine all this?
They're the honest people who see something up in the sky they can't identify, and they take video of it or photographs, and they post it on the internet and say, look at what I saw. Could this be a UFO? And usually, very often, they jump to the conclusion that it's an interplanetary object, whereas it might be a lens flare or something simple like that. I often get pictures that I call flash orbs, with or without a flash. Flash orbs are when you have light passing through the atmosphere in front of the camera, either from the flash of the camera or a sunbeam or high intensity lamp or something like that that illuminates the atmosphere that's close to the lens in front of the camera, and a dust particle goes through it. You're taking pictures of some scene, and when you take the picture, you don't notice anything unusual. You see the trees and houses or whatever is in the background. But then when you develop the picture, or when you look at it, if it's a digital camera, you just look at it, you don't develop it. When you look at the picture, you find a glowing typically a circular image that you didn't see before. Maybe you find a bunch of them. And these things I call flash orbs were first picked up by the first people who used digital cameras. There weren't so many reports of flash orbs, and in fact, I'm not aware of any reports. Back in the old days when you had to attach a flash to the camera and there was 4 or 5 inches between the lens of the camera and the flash bulb itself. But when they started having these miniature cameras where there's only like 1 inch or 2 inches between the lens and the flash, people started getting these, what I call flash orbs, in their pictures. And I remember the first ones that I came across in the middle 1990s. Some guy sent me a picture saying, oh, look at all the spirits flying around in this graveyard we were photographing, right next to a road where there was dust and dirt in the atmosphere and so on. I didn't know what was going on. What turned out to be the explanation didn't occur to me at that point. It wasn't until some guy, whose name I forget, but this is all spelled out on my website, the flash orb article, how a guy who had bought a new camera sent me an email message saying, I just got this new camera, whatever type it was and so on. And I keep getting these little glowing dots in the orbs.
Well, hold that thought. Bruce will be back after this commercial break. Thank you. It's fascinating. Back. Bye.
Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, could I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
Hey folks, Captain Nighthawk here. Do you have a favorite host? Well, imagine if you will having all the broadcast shows of 2013 to listen to anytime you want. Awesome deal, huh? Anyway, so stop by freedomslips.com and order the entire 2013 library of your favorite host for just $30. Not only do you help with the station funding to keep us on the air, you also help the host because they get half of the net on every order. Also, we have Revolution Radio's all-time favorite shows all on one disc. The details are really broad, so you'll have to visit the website and go look at the details yourself. It's, again, www.freedomslips.com/season2013.htm. And get your favorites. First come, first serve, 7 to 21 days for delivery. Thank you. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps, including me, Laser.
We've got to stop them! They're going to kill us all!
Tune in Tuesdays at 12 noon Eastern on Studio A to hear Tammy Adams share her knowledge of an unknown realm on Talking with Your Angels. Join Tammy as she uncovers hidden secrets about the spiritual world of angels, ghosts, and other entities that have been with us longer than we know. Tammy is a psychic, a teacher, spiritual coach, a leader in her field, and will be sharing her information and stories with you. So join us on Tuesdays at noon on Studio A. With Tammy's guidance, she'll find out who has been watching over you from the other side, and soon you will be talking with your angels.
Join Revolution Radio every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Studio B for Momentary Zen with host Zen Garcia at freedomslips.com, the People Station.
Revolution Radio. listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Aloha, everyone, and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and I am your host, Janet Kira Lesson, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lesson. And before we get back to our fascinating show with Dr. Bruce Maccabee, I'd like to remind everybody to please take a few minutes and walk your fingers over to that navigate over to that donation button on the website, and please do make a donation. We are listener supported, and we need your donation to continue to bring you these types of programs. So donate what you can, $1, $5, $15, $20, $100, whatever you can donate is greatly appreciated, and we do thank you very much for your donation. And we're in the middle of a fascinating conversation with Dr. Bruce Maccabee, and before we go bring Dr. Maccabee back on, do you have any questions to ask Bruce?
Well, I'm still coming back to this first question that's in my mind is, what on earth is the government's continuing interest in not revealing or in failing to disclose? And my hypothesis behind that is that it would open them up to suit and even criminal prosecution for crimes, things they've done against the law. That's my hypothesis, and I wonder if you could respond to that.
Well,
right.
I've long thought that if a person were to stand up and say, yep, they're real, it would sort of shut down the government for a period of time, but also the societal impact of realizing that, well, what I call past shock. You heard it here first, folks. Past shock. The flip side of future shock. Past shock is when you find that the history you've been told is wrong. That's not so surprising because a lot of people have learned wrong history. But in this situation, if the president got up and said, well, they've been here all along, we've known it, and now you got to suck it up. The question then is, what would happen to religion, what would happen to politics, what would happen to science, what would happen to economics, what would happen to you name it. Are people going to fly off the handle and head for the hills and then realize they can get you in the hills? It all depends really on how directly involved people are with the aliens, I guess. It's long been known that the idea of intelligent life out there is acceptable to science and doesn't bother anybody here on the earth as long as it stays out there. But if you find that other intelligences are coming here and messing around in our civilization, then it gets a little scary. It introduces a new uncertainty into an already uncertain life. And if there's one thing that progress can't stand, it's uncertainty.
Well, Dr. Les and I look at the ancient aliens phenomenon, which of course has spawned a television series in its 6th year, and all these millions of publications, not millions, but hundreds of publication books, and you can just put Planet X, Nibiru, Anunnaki into the search in Google, and you're going to pull up, thousands of websites. So that was interesting. So they've been here, in my opinion, they've been here all along, and so this whole history of our planet is a lie. And, of course, what would happen to the religions, when people find out it's not the fairy tale that they've been told. But I think it's time for childhood's end and for us to grow up, and I think we'd get over it. We got over Santa Claus. We would just get over it. And
the Tooth Fairy.
And the Tooth Fairy. We'd create a whole new society that might be more conscious and respect people.
Well, it's just that if you start disclosure, you've got the fact that people's lives and careers have been ruined by the disinformation, as well as possible even assassinations.
Right. And I was reading that the people that were abducted would probably sue all these people that are responsible for covering up their abductions.
It depends on the the amount of direct interaction between the aliens and humans.
Can you speak up a little bit? The producer says, yeah.
If the president makes an announcement and implies that, oh yeah, people have been taken on board craft and so on, then any individual person has to add this to his list of worries. Am I going to be abducted? And if so, am I going to be probed? And if so, is it going to impact on the rest of my life? I would agree that if they've been here since 1947, they've probably been here since 1847 or 1747 or 007 or been here for thousands of years. Because whatever they're doing for technology far exceeds anything we've got. They got here, we didn't get there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the interesting things from my research is how the Sumerians gave accurate descriptions of planets that were beyond human eyesight, and their orbits and the apparent movement of stars due to the precession of the equinoxes, and a lot of stuff that shows observation from beyond Earth.
Yeah, you're talking about the ancient alien stuff.
Exactly.
I don't necessarily believe all of the stuff that the guy with the big hair talks about, but
Giorgio.
Giorgio's.
It sure is interesting and thought provoking.
Yes. So anyway, we're
I like
researching.
to watch those shows because they go to places that I'll never get to.
Yes.
It makes your hair stand on end.
Well, they're great shows, and
we watch it.
What's left of it? Well, what about the modern era? Okay, so we have all these stories that, the early presidents, Eisenhower apparently was...
Roosevelt and Truman, too.
Yeah, but the Eisenhower was approached in 1954, which was the February 54, which was when I was born, and invited to make this contract. And what about those stories? Have you tracked any of them down? There's all these whistleblowers on their deathbed are coming out with these stories. What do you think of which presidents were in the know?
Well, some of the whistleblower stories may be true. I don't know about the Eisenhower situation. But there have been all sorts of stories since the 1950s, numerous contactee stories. Contactees typically have a good time, and abductees don't. So that's a way of dividing up, characterizing abductees and contactees. But anyway, the government, in my opinion, is never going to admit to anything until it gets to the point where everybody knows already, and then the government will say, yeah, we knew it all along. By that time, people will have sort of assimilated the reality into their own lifestyles.
Well, that brings up the point. Do you think, like with Snowden, that Russia's going to come out with the disclosure stuff first to try to humiliate Obama, and then it seems like the Pope might come out with something to humiliate the rest of the world? Somebody's going to beat them to the punch to do disclosure, make everybody else that's been holding back the truth look like a bunch of liars.
Sort of what I call the emperor has no throat, has no clothes syndrome. Eventually it'll get to the point where everybody knows it's real, and somebody will stand up and say, look, it's real, and everybody else will say, yep, we knew it.
Well, I hope we live to see that day. What do you think about the disclosure project that Greer and Bassett, they have the two different ones, and Steve Bassett is going to put out all those DVDs. I think it's this month up on Capitol Hill.
Demanding a hearing, a congressional
hearing. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, my own opinion is have at it. I don't know that you'll do any good, really. Like I said, the government, whoever's on the inside, has some reasons for not admitting right up front. If you read the book, you'll see that the cover-up began way back in the late 40s. And the coffin was nailed onto the interplanetary explanation by General John A. Sanford during a press conference in 1952 when there were hundreds of sightings in the United States, 1,000 sightings in the United States. the government has been bottling this stuff up for a long time, and they aren't likely to release anything until, as I said, it gets to the point where everybody knows it already, and then they might admit it. But there's some reason that they're keeping this quiet. It's not just an academic, oh, they might be here or they exist out there or something. I just don't know what this reason is. I mean, you can speculate that they're here to eat us or here to hybridize with us or something like that. The question is, do we face love, hate, or indifference? If it's love because they made us or they love us for some reason or other, we're safe. If it's hate, we better start shaking in our boots. If it's indifference, we just happen to exist on the earth, but they don't give a damn. They're after our gold, or they're after our water, or something like that. Then we can presume that we'll be able to go along in human history and not have to worry about them.
Well, you know, from the reports, it sounds like they have a technology that is so superior to ours that we really are relatively defenseless against them on the one hand. On the other hand, there's all these rumors that the so-called Star Wars missile defense was actually the development of weapons designed to protect us from aliens. Do you have anything?
Yeah, well, I worked on part of that project way back in the latter half of the 80s and so on, and I kept my ears peeled for any hint of the idea that the Strategic Defense Initiative weapons were directed outwards from the Earth as opposed to inwards toward the Earth. The official explanation, or the official reason for doing SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, was to be able to shoot down atomic missiles, presumably launched by the Soviet Union. And that would mean you had big lasers or particle beams or fast rockets all directed towards the Earth, essentially, or skimming the edge of the Earth to launch and hit these oncoming atomic bomb missiles. I didn't see any evidence of requirements for looking outwards away from the Earth as if you were trying to repel boarders from the outside. Maybe there were some super top secret requirements to be able to do that, but I don't know of anybody who worked on the program who
Do you think they would have been very effective even shooting down incoming missiles? Would they be able to actually hit them, or did they ever perfect that, even with the original story they were telling the public?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of what you said.
She wants to know if SDI worked.
Did it work? Could they actually shoot an incoming missile? Or did they even get that part working?
The Israelis have something like that.
Yeah, right. They're sort of the epitome of the situation right now. No, the answer is all that work was paperwork and working on various fundamental aspects of what would be a final defensive weapon. Like, for example, I worked on one part of the high-energy laser stuff, the steering of the beam. If you have this big laser, it's going to have this beam going off in some direction. You want the beam to go over and hit an atomic-powered missile that might be 100 miles away. You had to have a big mirror. You bounced the laser beam off a big mirror and focused it on this missile 100 miles away. And then you had to be able to track the missile. So this is one part of what you would need to do a defensive system with lasers. There are a lot of other parts that had to be mated up with what we worked with. But none of that stuff was put together into a whole missile, a whole defensive system to shoot down missiles, except for so-called airborne laser of the Air Force. That was a laser that was installed on a Boeing 747, I think, built into the airplane. And that was designed, or the argument for that was, we need to protect ourselves against a North Korean launch of missiles. So we'll have this airplane flying over the ocean off the coast of Korea. And if we can get within 20 miles, I think it was, of a missile that has been launched, this laser would have shot it down. But I think that program ultimately was canceled. SDI never built any real weapons.
So they basically were depending on mutually assured destruction that our subs would get them if they got mainland United States. And that was a step.
Mad work is what it amounts to.
Yeah.
Mutual assured destruction. After all, we're still here. If we had destroyed everything, if everything had been destroyed 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't be talking like we are right now. But the idea was in the late 70s and early 80s, a guy by the name of Stephen Fasoni, who, by the way, figures in the UFO business. He was a special consultant to the Air Force. He was arguing, why not have, instead of mutual assured destruction, mutual assured defense? And he's been called the father of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the conceptual father of it. That is, he was saying, and this word got to Reagan, that instead of sitting there in a situation where we could obliterate each other at the push of a button, why don't we put up defensive systems that are so effective that nobody can kill the other person? And that became mutual assured defense instead of mutual assured destruction. And that was the forerunner of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was an attempt to figure out the technologies necessary to carry out this amazing defense system that would allow no missiles through.
So what do you think was behind Reagan's statement about what if the aliens were our mutual enemy, how would we behave? And I think he said it twice.
He didn't refer to aliens directly, but he said, isn't there already an alien force or something like that? I forget exactly the terminology. Present, which is keeping us at war. I forget the exact...
Yeah, I forget exactly.
He didn't directly imply that extraterrestrial aliens were involved, but you might say that we know that he was a witness as a governor of California. He had a sighting while on an airplane, and so it could be that he was using a double entendre there, double meaning.
Well, I took it as aliens when I first saw it, and I went, whoa, what's he saying? And a lot of other people did. So anyway, that was an indication. Well, there's stories that actually I have a whistleblower that says that he talked to Reagan all the time about the Roswell craft in Area 51, but that's another story. I'll have to save that for another day, but I have talked about it on other shows.
Well, there's a story told by Steven Spielberg that when Close Encounters was shown for a private viewing at the White House, after it was all over, Reagan made some comment that there weren't 3 people in the room or whatever, some number like that really knew that was all true or worse to that effect.
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right, well, let's go back. Where were we? We were talking about the different sightings and the different contactees or experiencers or abductees, depending on if they had a good or a bad time. What about the contactee, abductees, experiencers? Like you said that Ed Walters you thought was a pretty good witness because he had physical markings, stigmata, as well as recovered memories and various different ways of validating his experience. What about people like Travis Walton and Betty and Barney Hill, Betty Andreasen, those type of experiencers? What do you think?
I think they've got part of the puzzle. Walton, I've always been impressed with Walton's experience. Not the movie version. At the very end of the movie, of course, they go way off into Hollywood.
Well, they're refilming it as we speak. I think it's being edited now, and they're doing a conference next weekend.
They're having a conference being set up by Travis, and I don't know if it's in Snowflake or wherever it is in Arizona.
Yeah, it's in 2 weeks. It's in first weekend in November. Yes.
And I don't, you know where it is?
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
Forget.
Well, anyway.
Oh, it's where the abduction was. They're going to retrace his footsteps, and they're going to go back to the
sentimental journey.
Yeah, sentimental. They're going to go to the police station and recreate the whole thing and take a tour on that journey.
Really interesting thing to do. Too bad I can't do it. But anyway, I've always been impressed by his story and read his books, you know, and I knew of the investigation as it was going on, the pros and cons, and it was a real nasty argument as to whether or not these guys were telling the truth. But the Betty and Barney Hill case, the case of the 4 ladies who were in a car that was lifted off the ground sometime in the middle 70s. I can't think of the name of the place now.
Okay.
I haven't really spent a lot of time on abduction stuff. Now I know that I remember one of the most convincing guys was in Bud Hopkins' first book, Missing Time, the lawyer in the Washington, D.C. area, and I spoke to him directly, and basically he said, well, now his story was he's driving from Baltimore to, what's the place? A place in Maryland, which will come to me as I talk, I hope. He's driving along Route 40, which back in the 50s or 60s was, I guess, a 2-lane road. But anyway, he was driving along Route 40 heading west. And what he consciously remembered was he's driving along, and all of a sudden he sees this thing, and the next thing he knows, he sees this light coming down. Next thing he knows, he's on the road to, not Orwell or something or other. I can't think of the name of the place, but he's going to meet some people at a bar there. He shows up, and they say, "What? How come you're 2 hours late?" or whatever the time was. He didn't realize he was 2 hours late, but he remembered this funny event. So sometime later, several years later, whatever, he meets Bud Hopkins, and Hopkins does a regression, or the lady who worked with him does a regression. In any case, under regression, he's driving along in his truck. His light comes down. He drives his truck off the side of the road, parks in a field. Creatures come out of this thing, which also landed, come over and float him out of the vehicle and into the thing, and he goes through standard procedure A for probing human beings. And then he comes back, he gets floated back into his truck and gets back on the road, and he's driving along, and he becomes conscious several miles beyond and doesn't realize there's any missing time until he gets to the bar. Now, in talking to him about this experience, what he recalled consciously compared to what he came out of hypnosis, he's very conservative about it. He says, I believe in the stuff that I saw consciously. There was some white light object that came down in front of me. I don't know whether to believe in what came out under hypnosis or not. So here's a guy rational enough to question his own, you might say, his own source of information being himself, but he's questioning himself. That to me is impressive. Instead of flying off the handle and saying, "Look, folks, I've been abducted and taken away to the Andromeda Galaxy and flown light years around the world and so on." He was skeptical of his own experience, which is fine.
Right. Well, you have this book called Abduction in My Life, a Novel of Alien Encounters. It was published in July of 2001, and you're the author. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and what's behind that?
Well, I have long felt that if you're going to end up proving these things are real, you better do something about what do you do about it, or you give some help to the people who are confronted with this thing. So I wrote this book. I started off writing what was intended to be just an example case of an abduction. and then it was going to be a straight documented type of book after that. But as I got into the abduction story, you might say, and I had never written fiction before. As I got into the abduction story, I began to realize this was something I could carry through into a story. Mm-hmm. And it sort of developed as I wrote, you might say. And I'm sure there were a lot of authors who said that. The story tended to develop as I wrote, but I came up with a novel way of writing a book in which the factual evidence is completely separated from the fictional. If you read fiction books, or one book that had struck me was called Genesis by a guy by the name of William Harbinson, and it was a story, a rather long story, UFO stuff, in which he incorporated actual Project Blue Book information into the story. But if you were but it was mixed up with fictional stuff. So if you were a typical reader who was not an expert in the UFO field, you would have a choice of either believing the whole thing or rejecting it all because you don't know what's real and what isn't. Mm-hmm. So I said, how do you write a book in which it's clear to the reader what's real and what isn't? And I solved that problem by writing an inside book, you might say. The outside book, the fiction book, involves a main character who gets asked the question of somebody's UFO experience, which turns out to be an abduction, and what does this mean? And the main character in the book, whose name you never find out, is not even as clear as I am. Call me Ishmael and Moby Dick. This main character investigates his friend's abduction report. And he decides he needs to get some information on UFOs because he's never paid any attention to UFOs before. Being a logical, rational, scientific type of person, he's rejected the idea of UFOs. So he goes to the library and finds a book called What You Should Know About Unidentified Flying Objects. And he reads that book, and you essentially read it right along with him. If you were to turn into the book a dozen or so pages, you would find the text, type of text changes, the nature of the manner of writing changes. It becomes very straightforward, and it uses information that's completely documented. It's the only fiction book with a bibliography at the end of it, or a list of references. You can take the fact book and literally cut it out of the main book and paste all the pages together in the fact book and have a reference book for UFOs. It covers all aspects of the subject, including abductions. And I won't give the story away, but this main character finds out that he's a lot closer to abduction than he ever imagined. Not that he's an abductee, but somebody else is. And, this leads him at the very end of the book to have this big, long speculative conversation with the ostensible author of the inside book. So you have the main character and taking one side, and the author of the book being the guy who's the expert in the subject, taking the other side, you might say, of this big long discussion that's in the last chapter.
Bruce,
that book was launched in August of 2001, and I had a little bit of money for advertisement, but when 9/11 hit, there was a sudden drying out of interest in UFOs, as you can well imagine.
Yes.
What was you were saying about the principal character true of you, that you found as you got deeper into it that somebody in your life was more involved with contact than you had thought?
I have been accused of writing about myself.
Yeah.
I mean, apparently the writing is that convincing. But the fact of the matter is, I'm portrayed as the guy who wrote the book, the inside book.
Mm-hmm. We find a lot of researchers, once they get into their own lives, they realize that they too have had experiences with extraterrestrials. That's why they got involved in researching to begin with. And it's not 100%, but there's just a significant number. And so when I saw you wrote this book, I wondered if your subconscious was trying to get something out that You don't have to say yes. But
yeah, I don't consider myself to be an abductee.
Mm-hmm.
But
well,
I had read enough. I had read enough about it so that I was able to write a book that's gotten 5-star reviews, and including from the abductees themselves who have read the book.
Fascinating. And then I saw on your website something. There's two more things I want to talk about your website, and your website's great. I didn't get to go into all of it, but Tesla, interested in the Master of Lightning? Send me an email if you're interested in making a Hollywood-level action movie based on the life and accomplishments of Nikola Tesla. Script and possible theme music already written. What does that mean? That's on your website.
Just what it says. No, I have not got a fully developed screenplay. It would require somebody who's a professional to do that. What I have is what we call the treatment, written in screenplay format. All the conversations and the descriptions, general descriptions of the scenery and the various places and so on. It's based on the fundamental plot that Hitler's spies attempt to steal the plans for Tesla's secret beam weapon. And I've tried to write this in such a way that it wiggles its way between the actual history of the subject and introduces what is a fiction story, but could be true. We know that, in fact, Hitler's scientists were doing everything they could to come up with secret weapons to attack the Allies with, or to defend Germany, as the case may be. So the idea that they might have been interested in Tesla's weapon is not far-fetched. The actual story is written, of course, is made up by me, but it's a foil for looking into Tesla's own personal history, where he came from, how he developed his talents, and moved to the United States and worked for what's his name?
Thomas Edison.
Yes. Most people say, what's his name, when you're trying to think of Tesla, because they never heard of Tesla. So I got back at him by not remembering what's his name.
What's his name? Oh, what's his name? Yes.
Anyway, it goes far beyond that. And I assume in this book that Tesla actually tested his secret weapon. He claims that he did. He had several secret laboratories, it is said, and for a while there he had enough money to carry out experiments. It is a known fact that he had an article in newspapers in the 1930s about a beam weapon that would shoot down aircraft at 200 miles or something like that. Mm-hmm. So the known actual history is would make it logical for the Germans to try to get information on how to build such a weapon. And so in my story, the German spies get in a submarine. They debark from the submarine off the coast of Connecticut, take a trip down to the New York City, where Tesla is living in a hotel in New Yorker, and they go and visit him and fake him out, as it were. They pull a trick to get him to release, write a document saying that it's okay for them to look into a trunk that he has stored in the basement of another hotel I forget the name of, and they get the plans and start heading for the airfield to get off the Long Island and go back to Germany. And I won't tell the climax of the story, but all this time the FBI is trying to figure out what's going on. The FBI learns almost immediately that some German spies have landed on the coast, and the FBI is trying to find out whether or not, one thing the FBI tries to do is find out whether or not this guy Tesla, remember, this is happening in 1942 and 43. Right. Tesla was famous in 1900. The guys in the FBI and various scientific organizations had all barely known of Tesla's accomplishments between 1890 and 1910, I guess you might say. So they had to have their knowledge regenerated of what Tesla was and his capabilities, and one thing I have in the script is a couple of places where Tesla does his eidetic memory trick of being able to create an image of something in his brain, a machine, with all the parts working, and then run it and see if it works.
Right.
And I say that the CGI guys can have a field day coming up with how this might work, penetrating into Tesla's head and then seeing
See what
these
he
structures
does.
suddenly be generated. And Tesla said that everything that he did, he built in his head first. He then went and made it in hardware, you might say, and it worked.
It worked perfectly. Yeah, every time. What do you think he was murdered?
Well, you mean in real life? I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably not. I contemplated having the story that the story takes place. Most of the story takes place in the day before Tesla dies. And I contemplated having. I wouldn't mind if somebody who buys this script wants to make it look that way. The German spies visiting Tesla leave him with something that makes sure that he's not going to tell anybody else what his secret is.
Well, I thought maybe the U.S. took his inventions, not the Germans. But they all disappeared. Mysterious fire. What about the Philadelphia experiment? What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's a lot of hype myself.
A lot of
I
hype.
think there was a Philadelphia experiment having to do with magnetic mine invisibility. I don't believe that the Eldridge was transferred from Philadelphia to Norfolk and back again in the blinking of an eye. There may have been an experiment that involved high currents flowing through wires strapped around this vessel. One thing that the Navy really wanted to do was make their ships, which were steel, make them invisible to magnetic mines. If you could do that, then you obviously would be safer for your vessels if you could penetrate an unfriendly harbor without worrying about magnetic mines being there. Magnetic mines detect a warping of the magnetic field in the vicinity of the mine. These huge Navy ships cause the Earth's magnetic field to get bent considerably. And so there's some distance, I don't know, tens or hundreds of feet that you could be with respect to a magnetic mine and have it go off because it senses you. If you could reduce the magnetic signature of the ship, there'd be less probability of triggering a magnetic mine. To reduce the magnetic signature of the ship, you create a magnetic field that opposes, its opposite in polarity, in a sense, to the field that's around the ship itself. So you would create this opposing field by running big wires, heavy wires that carry a lot of current around the ship in various places. And I think that was probably what was being done. This would be especially important for a so-called minesweeper type of ship that tries to detect these mines and set them off so at a safe distance. But you wouldn't want your own ship to set the mine off. You want to be able to set it off by some controlled magnetic signature other than the ship itself. So the bottom line is I think that an experiment did occur, and there may have been big electric arcs going off, and somebody might have gotten hurt, but I don't think anybody disappeared. I don't think anybody got transferred any long distances and time warps and all that sort of stuff.
What about Tesla's alternative energy system? I read that he had retrofitted cars, and they were operating out of something that just came from the air, and that was I mean, if you think about it, we have technology. We have computers that are very advanced technology, and we still have primitive transportation systems based on fossil fuels these systems were developed in 1900, right? Our planes and our cars and our trains, and they haven't really done the quantum leap that our computers and other forms of technology. So to me, it's obvious that somebody's repressing these technologies. And then when you earlier we were talking about why wouldn't there be disclosure, because there's no money in it. People would lose their besides all the ramifications of they've been doing illegal actions is that they would lose their power and control and their money stream if they were to make these changes that the extraterrestrial technologies and the awareness of extraterrestrials would cause in our total social system. And I just wanted to interject that. Sasha, what would you like to ask?
I think that the people with big money would just invest in the new technology. They have the capital to ride with whatever's for sale.
Okay.
Yeah. Tesla had the idea of being able to transmit power through the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And supposedly that was ruled out by J.P. Morgan because that would mean that you wouldn't have to, they couldn't make any money by selling hundreds of miles worth of, or thousands of miles worth of copper wire. But Tesla's idea was not for free energy. It was somebody had to pay for that energy. Somebody paid for it at the source. Somebody who was using it would pay the source transmitter, as it were, for some certain amount of electricity. It would still have been meterable, you might say, but just not the way we do it now. And it wouldn't have had to have copper. However, my impression is if his Wardenclyffe system, for example, had been thoroughly developed, you would have found electrostatic noise in the atmosphere far beyond what we've got now, and it might have made early radio very difficult to amplitude, so-called AM radio, very difficult to use with huge electrical currents flowing in the atmosphere.
Don't we have a lot of electrical currents now with all these cell phone towers and everything, and all these things still work?
No, I'm talking about currents similar to lightning bolts.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa.
You listen to a lightning bolt on an AM radio, and you can hear this huge crackling noise. If you had power being transmitted, if you were near a power transmitter, you would get this crackling noise continuously if it were a Tesla type of transmitter.
I had a guest on a show yesterday where we were talking about the power system, how the Roswell craft was powered, and they were saying it was nuclear, but it just pulled the nuclear particles that's available throughout the atmosphere and out in space, and it wasn't anything. So it seemed to be like a free energy system, just pulling it from the air. I didn't get the impression that Tesla was using what you were saying, but anyway, I'm not an expert by any means. But what do you think these craft are operating? Any whistleblowers coming forth with, like we had, what was his name, Robert Lazar, talking about the propulsion systems, and any ideas on how these craft are operating?
Well, I really don't. I've been leaving the theorizing to other people and trying to develop the proof of existence first. A lot of us have said, well, we know it's all real, but it's not. The reality hasn't completely penetrated the society yet, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I hope in this new book. And by the way, I should say there's a difference between the UFO FBI connection that I wrote in 2000, 14 years ago, as is mentioned on your website, and the new one, the FBI CIA UFO connection. The new one is better written and brings in documentation that I was not allowed to use. I couldn't publish any actual documents except for 2 of them. In the first book, it was published by the Llewellyn Company. They told me it was too expensive to put in the actual documents. So here you can actually see the actual documents referred to, better writing, better thinking, and the CIA involvement. And the third part of the book is my own experiences, direct experiences with the CIA. For example, in 1993, my CIA contact called me up one, I think it was on a Tuesday afternoon when I was at home doing some chores, and he said, I want you to write a briefing for the President's Science Advisor. And that blew me away. The President's Science Advisor, this is a top-level briefing he wants me to do on UFOs. And the briefing that I actually wrote is in the book. The amusing anecdotal story is I was told that I had to have this briefing done the next day at 8 o'clock so that Gibbons would have it before he had a meeting. He was going to have a meeting with Lawrence Rockefeller and another guy on UFOs. Gibbons didn't know anything about UFOs. He wanted to know something about it before this meeting. So
which president was this?
Clinton.
For Clinton, okay.
This is the very, very beginning of Clinton's administration.
Mm-hmm.
And Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to get something equivalent in those days to the disclosure years later, but he wanted to get Clinton to say something about UFOs. But first he had to get past the science advisor. And the science advisor, when he found out that this was going to be a meeting about UFOs, apparently panicked, called up the CIA guy and said, I got to have some information on UFOs. And so I had known this CIA guy for about 9 years, and he knew I could give lectures on it and stuff. So he called me up to do the briefing for Gibbons. I assumed when he first said I'd like to write a briefing for President Clinton's science advisor, John Gibbons, my first thought was, well, it'll be a week or two before I'll have plenty of time to make slides and develop a presidential top-level briefing. The next thing the guy says is it's got to be done by tomorrow.
Wow.
How the hell am I going to do that? And then he says, you have to fax it before 8 o'clock in the morning.
So how did you get it done?
And it was like
did you
1
stay
or 2
up all
o'clock in
night?
the afternoon. Yeah, well, I just about did. I had to come up with a page-and-a-half top-level structured briefing with various references called tabs, tab A, tab B, tab C, each tab being one or more pages of a description of something that was referred to in the main page-and-a-half briefing. As I said, you can read it and anybody can decide how well I did by looking at what's in the book. But the kicker is I sent this thing off at 8 o'clock like I was supposed to, and then I waited to hear if, any feedback. The next thing I'm told is, guess what? The meeting was at 7:30.
Oh
no.
That's the way Washington works.
Well, do you think he ever saw it?
Well, and weeks later, first of all, I was only able to complete the top level page and a half, which was essentially the summary of the briefing. I wasn't able to complete all the tabs to fax at 8 o'clock. I completed them the next day and sent them off, so that Gibbons would have had some information to work from, but he wouldn't have had the in-depth arguments that I got into the so-called tabular information. But I was told weeks later that he did read it, although I never got any feedback on it. And there's another amusing thing is, a few years later, Grant Cameron and some other people wrote to the White House under the Freedom of Information Act asking for anything having to do with Lawrence Rockefeller and what was then called a disclosure attempt by Rockefeller and C.B. Scott Jones. And they got back a bunch of pages related to the Lawrence Rockefeller initiative, but they didn't get back my briefing for Gibbons. That got buried somewhere. And if you look at Grant Cameron's website, the presidential UFO website, I think it's www.presidentialufo.com, you can find the briefing that I sent to him, to Grant Cameron, so that he'd have it. But when I too wrote under the Freedom of Information Act to get all the documents from the White House, and I too failed to find my briefing paper.
Well, I wonder why Clinton went on to, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel or something, and he said that he said that he had tried to get the information on UFOs, and they of course they made fun of it.
You're out of the loop, they told him.
Webster Hubbell, and years later, wrote that one of the first things when Clinton took over the administration as president one of the first things he asked Hubble to do was find out who killed JFK and find out if flying saucers were real or something to that effect. And Hubble was not able to come up with any specific information on JFK, and he said he couldn't get anybody to talk about flying saucers. I forget the exact thing, but my involvement was in 1993, writing that briefing. But the Lawrence Rockefeller Initiative continued in 1995, in the fall of 95, I think it was. Clinton and Mrs. Clinton took their vacation at Rockefeller's ranch on the near the Grand Teton Mountains in Wyoming.
Right.
What was that? Jackson Hole.
And she was seen carrying this book they thought was a UFO book.
We speculate that Lawrence Rockefeller briefed Clinton on what was known about flying saucers at that point.
You know, when things like that disappear, it's usually someone is using your report and taking credit for it. I'm a college professor, and that's often what happens.
Well, I hope it does them good.
Hope they got an A.
Anyway, like I said, you can read it as an appendix to the book.
Well, that's very interesting, because if they did actually end up getting it, even though it disappeared, and then Hillary becomes president, then she has read your briefing.
Well, maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
I had other interesting adventures with the CIA, starting right from when I first got involved in 1979, as I was investigating in New Zealand. You asked me what cases I liked the best, and one of the best were the New Zealand sightings of December 31st, 1978. These sightings involve multiple witnesses on board an airplane, ground radar, airplane radar, and tape recordings made at the time. So we had a tape recording on the airplane and a tape recording at the Wellington Air Traffic Control Center, and also 16mm color movie. It was a internationally famous sighting when the TV crew that announced they had the world's first film of UFOs.
Wow.
And I was asked to investigate and see if that were true or not. And part of my investigation, I needed consultation on the radar stuff, and some guy I talked to suggested I talk to the CIA radar expert, and I was floored with that suggestion. I never would have thought to talk to the CIA. After all, they were considered to be one of the bad boys of ufology. A lot of people thought they were controlling the hard evidence. So, but nevertheless, I went there and briefed them on the sightings, and after that, after a couple of meetings where I didn't get much help, but they got a lot of information out of me, I left the CIA. I didn't go there. I went there 3 times and didn't go in again. And then 5 years later, I get called up by the CIA, a CIA guy who's investigating what's called laser-generated underwater sound. He had noticed that the Soviets were publishing a lot of papers on that phenomenon, and very few in the United States, and he wondered who was doing the work, if anybody. He found out that I was doing work at the Naval Surface Warfare Center on this laser-generated underwater sound. And he called me up and asked me if I could give a presentation the next day on, and this is in 1984, the summer of 1984. He calls me up and asks if I can give a presentation the next day on this laser-generated underwater sound phenomenon. And I said, sure. I didn't say anything about me being there before, 5 years earlier. He called me up a couple hours later to talk about some details of this presentation I was going to make, and then he says, by the way, I understand you've been here before. My jaw sort of hit the floor, and I thought, oh, there goes my credibility. Down the tubes. Because I had to admit that I had been there before, and he said that I asked him how he found out about it. He said, well, one of the guys you talked to recognized your name.
Oh.
And so that led to many years, really, of interactions between me and the CIA people. I actually gave UFO lectures there a number of times, and all this stuff is in the book. It's quite an interesting story, I think.
Wow. We have 3 minutes. What would you like to tell our audience in the last 3 minutes of this show that they need to know?
About how to get your books and see your website.
Yeah, but one last story I think we have time for.
You can get my book as a paperback. If you order a paperback through me, I can send you a autographed copy. Or you can get an ebook. The ebook you can download and read instantaneously. It only costs $10.
Mm-hmm.
In either case, you're going to get the same information. And the first part of the book is sort of like ancient history revisited, but I think it'll convince you that the Air Force was covering up stuff right from the very beginning. And then the last part of the book will show you what the CIA was doing in recent years.
And this past February at the UFO Congress, you received the Lifetime Achievement Award. What was it like getting an award recognition at that level?
I was not feeling well and not able to attend, but it was done in absentia, but I was certainly gratified to get the award. And there is a video on the net that anybody can go to, and I guess you've got it on your website.
Yeah, my website is aquarianradio.com, and I put up a page. But the best place for the information is at Bruce's website, which is BRUMAC.8K, like K like in Ken.com. Is that correct?
Yes, brumac.8k.com.
Are you appearing anywhere this year? Are you going to be doing any presentations?
I'm considering taking on an invitation to go to Cleveland, Ohio sometime, but basically I don't have anything lined up right now.
Okay.
I do expect to be talking in Lima, Ohio at the library sometime in the middle of November. I don't know exactly what the date will be yet. I've already given a lecture to the local UFO Research Association here in Lima, and I plan to be talking at the Lima Library sometime, as I said, in a few weeks.
Are you living in? Is that where you live, Ohio?
Yes.
Where you live? Okay, you're in Ohio. Great. And let's see what else. So your website and what are your 3 books again? Just so people know the titles.
Well, the older book, which has been superseded, the UFO FBI Connection.
Okay. That's the end of our show. And thank you so much,
Thanks, Bruce.